He gave shelter to a Saxon fugitive. Days later, the berserker horde found his village. The morning mist clung to the birch trees like the breath of dying men, and Thorvald, the Iron Hand, knew something was wrong. The forest was too quiet, too still. His weathered fingers tightened around his hunting spear as he moved through the skeletal white branches, each footstep crunching through the frost like breaking bones. The scent of pine and approaching snow filled his nostrils. But underneath it all lurked something else. Something that made his warrior instincts scream danger. Then he saw him, a Saxon, bloodied, broken, stumbling between the trees like a walking corpse. Fresh shackle marks carved deep into his wrists, still weeping crimson against the snow. The man's eyes. By Thor's hammer, those eyes held the same haunted look Thorvald had seen in his own reflection after they burned his brother's ship, after they left good Viking warriors as carrion for the ravens. The Saxon collapsed just 20 paces away, his lips moving in desperate whispers about Christian dungeons and Norman cruelty. Everything in Thorvald's soul roared vengeance. Every fiber of his being demanded he leave this enemy to freeze. But those eyes, those broken, desperate eyes, sparked something he thought the flames had burned out of him forever. Compassion. Reluctant. Unwanted, but real.
Ei, antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer um alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. Ah, e me conta nos comentários. De qual cidade você está assistindo? Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir.
Against every warning, his wife Astrid would hiss through gritted teeth. Thorvald hauled the stranger back to their isolated settlement. The wind howled across the frozen lake, like the cries of the dishonored dead, and the Saxons' fevered mumblings painted pictures of Prior Dunstan's torture chambers that made even a hardened Viking's stomach turn. Aldrich, My name is Aldrich. Days passed like slow-moving ice flows. The Saxon's strength returned, and with it came something Thorvald never expected. Laughter. The sound of his children giggling as Aldrich taught them Saxon runes by the crackling hearth fire. The warmth of shared meals where old enemies broke bread together. The taste of venison stew flavored not with hatred, but with hope. Astrid watched it all with ice-blue eyes that missed nothing. "You trust too easily, husband," she murmured one night as they lay beneath thick firs, her breath visible in the frigid air. Saxons are wolves in sheep's wool. But Thorvald found his heart softening like spring ice. This broken man who carved toys for their youngest son, who helped patch their roof against the howling winds, who spoke of Norman cruelty with the same pain that burned in Thorvald's chest. How could he be the enemy? The settlement felt different with Aldrich there. Warmer, somehow, despite the deepening winter that painted their world in shades of white and gray. The children's voices rang clearer across the frozen ground. The fires burned brighter. Even the harsh wind off the lake
seemed gentler. 3 weeks passed in this strange peace. 3 weeks of questioning everything he'd believed about Saxon hearts and Viking honor. 3 weeks of watching his enemy become something dangerously close to family. Then came the dawn that shattered it all. The sound erupted across the frozen lake, like the roar of Fenrir himself. War horns, berserker horns, the bone-chilling battle cry that turned men's blood to ice water and made even the bravest warriors check their weapons twice. Ragnar Bloodaxe. Thorvald bolted upright in his furs, his hand instinctively reaching for his axe. Through the small window, he could see them emerging from the morning mist, like creatures from hell itself. Shields glinting in the pale dawn light, battle standards snapping in the wind. The dreaded berserker horde that left nothing but ash and screams in their wake. But it was the look on Aldrich's face that stopped Thorvald's heart cold. Not fear, not surprise, something far, far worse. Recognition. And in that terrible moment, as the war cries echoed across the ice, and his children began to stir in terror, Thorvald realized he had made a mistake that would cost them all everything. The truth about his Saxon guest was about to be revealed, and the price of his compassion, the price would be written in blood. Aldrich's face went pale as freshly fallen snow, but not with fear, with shame. The kind of shame that burns through a man's soul like molten iron through flesh. His trembling hand reached beneath his tunic and withdrew something that made Thorvald's world shatter like ice struck by Mjolnir. An axe pendant, familiar, impossibly familiar. The same twisted dragon carving, the same notch in the blade where it had caught on chainmail. The same leather cord, stained with blood that had never fully washed clean. Bjorn's pendant, his brother's pendant, torn from his neck as the flames consumed everything Thorvald had ever loved. You. The word scraped from Thorvald's throat like grinding stone. You were there, at the burning of Skjaldvik. Aldrich's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of innocence. They were the tears of a man carrying the weight of slaughter on his shoulders. I led them to your brother's hall. I was the scout, the one who counted your warriors, mapped your defenses. The war horns grew louder, closer. Through the window, Ragnar's berserkers spread across the ice like blood pooling on snow. But all Thorvald could see was his brother's face, twisted in agony as Norman steel found his heart. 3 years, Thorvald whispered, his hand finding his axe handle. 3 years I've dreamed of finding the Saxon dog who sold my brother's life for Norman silver. But Aldrich held up a trembling hand, and the words that spilled from his lips turned everything to madness. Look at the pendant, Thorvald. Look closer. The dragon's eyes. They weren't carved gems, as Thorvald had always believed. They were real. And as his gaze fell upon them, they began to glow with an otherworldly fire that had nothing to do with any Christian god or Norse deity he knew. Your brother didn't die that night, Aldrich rasped. The pendant, it holds souls, Thorvald. Norman sorcery. Dark magic that even Prior Dunstan fears. Bjorn's spirit has been trapped inside ever since the flames took his body. The berserker horn screamed across the lake, and suddenly Thorvald understood why Ragnar had come. Not for Saxon gold or Viking vengeance. For the pendant. Astrid's voice cut through his shock like a blade through flesh. Husband. Her tone carried a different kind of terror now. She stood at the window, her face white as bone. The Berserkers, their leader. Thorvald looked and saw a face that should have been rotting in Valhalla's halls these past 3 years. Bjorn. His brother Bjorn, leading Ragnar's horde across the ice, his eyes glowing with the same unholy fire as the pendant's dragon gaze. His beloved brother's face, twisted with rage and something far worse than death. The pendant grew hot against Aldrich's palm, pulsing like a beating heart. He's been hunting it, Thorvald. Hunting the prison that holds half his soul. And Aldrich's voice broke completely. I brought him right to your door. The pendant's glow intensified, casting dancing shadows across the longhouse walls, like flames from Muspelheim itself. But as Thorvald stared at his brother's approaching form across the ice, something far more terrible began to unfold. Astrid's scream shattered the air behind him. He spun to find his wife clutching their youngest son. Her face twisted with horror as she stared at Aldrich. But it wasn't fear in her eyes anymore. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that cuts deeper than any blade. The scar, she whispered, pointing at a mark on Aldrich's neck that his beard had hidden until now. A crescent-shaped brand, barely visible in the pendant's eerie light. I know that mark. Aldrich's hand flew to his throat, but it was too late. The truth was bleeding out like a mortal wound. Thorvald's world tilted on its axis. That scar. He knew it too. Every Viking knew it. The mark of the Bloodsworn. The secret brotherhood of Saxon converts who had sworn themselves to Norman lords through the darkest of rituals. Warriors who had willingly traded their souls for power. You're not running from Prior Dunstan, Thorvald breathed. You serve him. But Aldrich shook his head frantically, tears streaming down his cheeks. No, you don't understand. I was Bluntsworn, yes, but the pendant. When I touched your brother's pendant, everything changed. The dragon's magic doesn't just trap souls, Thorvald. It reveals truth. The Saxon's voice cracked like breaking ice. I'm not Aldrich the fugitive. I'm Aldrich the Oathbreaker. And 3 years ago, when I led the Normans to Skjoldvik, God forgive me, I wasn't just their scout. The berserker horns grew deafening, but Thorvald could barely hear them over the roar of blood in his ears. I was their executioner. I put the blade through your brother's heart myself. Astrid's sob filled the longhouse, but Aldrich wasn't finished. His words came faster now, desperate, as if confession could somehow wash away the stains on his soul. But when Bjorn died, the pendant activated. It split his soul in two. Half went into the dragon's eyes, trapped forever. The other half, Aldrich's voice broke completely. The other half possessed me. For 3 years, I've been carrying Bjorn inside my mind, fighting for control. Through the window, the undead berserker that wore his brother's face drew closer. Ice cracking beneath feet that should have been bones and ash. But now Thorvald could see something else in those glowing eyes. Not just rage, desperate, burning love. The same love Bjorn had always held for his family. He's not leading them here to destroy you, Aldrich whispered. He's coming to save you. The Normans discovered what the pendant really is. It's not just a soul prison, Thorvald. It's a key. A key to something buried beneath Prior Dunstan's cathedral. Something that could raise an army of the dead and give the Normans power over life and death itself. The longhouse door exploded inward, and there stood Bjorn, in rotting flesh and rusted mail, his eyes burning with otherworldly fire. But his words, when they came, were spoken in perfect harmony with Aldrich's voice. "Brother," they said in unison, "one living mouth, and one that should have been silent forever. We need to destroy the pendant before sunrise, because at dawn, Prior Dunstan arrives with 1,000 blood-sworn warriors." Bjorn's corpse lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. "And this time, we're going to give them a proper Viking welcome." The pendant pulsed once more, and suddenly, Thorvald understood the most horrifying truth of all. This wasn't about rescue or revenge. This was about war. A war between the living and the dead, with his family caught in the middle. And somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll. The church bells tolled like the death knells of giants, and with each bronze note that echoed across the frozen lake, something inside the pendant began to crack. Not the metal itself, but something far deeper. Something that had been waiting 3 long years for this exact moment. Thorvald watched in horror as his brother's corpse moved with fluid grace, stepping into the longhouse like he owned it, like death itself had never touched him. But it was Astrid's sharp intake of breath that made his blood turn to slush. "The bells," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the tolling. "Those aren't Christian bells, husband. Listen to the rhythm." And by Thor's hammer, she was right. The pattern wasn't the call to morning prayers. It was older, much older. The ancient summoning rhythm that every child of the North knew from cradle songs and nightmare tales. The bone bell of Hel herself. Bjorn's dead eyes fixed on the pendant in Aldrich's trembling hands. But when he spoke, his voice carried an echo that seemed to come from the bottom of a grave. "Brother, you need to know something before we die here together." Thorvald's axe felt heavy as stone in his grip. What more could there be? The corpse that had once been his beloved brother smiled, and maggots fell from between its teeth. "Prior Dunstan isn't coming to claim the pendant. He's coming to thank me for delivering it exactly where he needed it to be." The world stopped. Even the wind ceased its howling. Aldrich's face drained of all color. "What are you saying?" "The pendant was never a prison," Bjorn's rotting lips whispered. "It was bait, and every decision you've made these past 3 years, every step that led you here to my brother's door, I've been guiding you, pushing you, because the dragon's eyes don't trap souls, brother." The pendant began to pulse faster, its glow spreading like infection through the longhouse walls. "They devour them, and they're hungry for more." Thorvald's mind reeled as the terrible truth crashed over him like an avalanche. His brother hadn't been possessed by Norman magic. He'd been working with them all along. The burning of Skjoldvik, the death, the years of grief, all of it orchestrated. "You betrayed us," Thorvald breathed. "Your own blood." But Bjorn shook his head, and when he spoke, His voice cracked with something that might have been genuine anguish. "I saved us, brother. All of us. Do you know what Prior Dunstan promised me? What he swore on his Christ grave?" Through the window, more figures emerged from the mist. Not berserkers. Men in monks' robes, carrying torches that burned with the same unholy fire as the pendant. Behind them came something that made Thorvald's warrior heart quail. A funeral procession, carrying coffins. Dozens of them. "Eternal life," Bjorn whispered. "For everyone we've ever lost. Mother, father, little Ingrid who died of the fever. Everyone, brother. All we have to do is feed the dragon enough Viking souls, and they'll come back. Just like me." Astrid's scream shattered the moment. She was staring at the coffins, with eyes wide as silver coins. "Thorvald, look at the coffins. Look at the names carved on the lids." He looked, and saw his own children's names glowing in runic script on the wood. Names that hadn't been there moments before. Names that were writing themselves in letters of fire as he watched. The pendant's glow exploded outward, and suddenly every soul in the room could feel it. The hunger, the ancient, endless hunger that had been growing stronger with each act of kindness Thorvald had shown the Saxon. Each moment of trust, each spark of hope, all of it feeding the dragon, all of it making the pendant strong enough for what came next. Prior Dunstan's voice echoed across the ice like the judgment of God himself. "The harvest is ready, my children. Bring me the family that harbored our faithful servant. Their love will open the gates of paradise." And in that moment of absolute horror, as the monks began their unholy chanting and the coffins creaked open to reveal silk-lined emptiness waiting to be filled, Thorvald realized the most devastating truth of all. His compassion hadn't damned them. It had been the key to their resurrection. But as Thorvald stared at those coffins, bearing his children's names, something stirred in the deepest corners of his memory. Something about the way Prior Dunstan's voice carried across the ice. The accent beneath the Latin prayers. The rhythm of words that seemed almost familiar. Astrid's hand flew to her throat, her fingers finding the small iron hammer she'd worn since childhood. "That voice," she whispered, her eyes wide with recognition that cut deeper than any blade. "Thorvald, I know that voice." The pendant's glow flickered, and in that moment of wavering light, Prior Dunstan stepped from behind his procession of monks. The hood fell back from his face, revealing features that made Thorvald's axe clatter to the floor. Leif, his youngest brother, the one they'd mourned for 15 years, the brother who had supposedly drowned in the North Sea during his first raid, his body never found. The brother whose funeral ship they'd burned empty while their mother wept tears that could have filled fjords. "Hello, Thorvald," Prior Dunstan said, and now the voice was unmistakably Leif's, though aged and hardened by years of something far worse than battle. "Did you miss your little brother?" The world tilted like a ship taking on water. Astrid's sob echoed through the longhouse as the truth crashed over them with the force of a winter storm. Leif wasn't just alive. He hadn't just survived whatever fate had claimed him on that distant sea. He had orchestrated everything. 15 years, Leif continued, his monk's robes rustling as he stepped closer to the window. 15 years I've been building this moment. Do you know what it's like to watch your own family burn funeral ships for you while you serve a new god? While you learn that the Christ's power makes our old gods look like children playing with wooden swords? Bjorn's corpse turned toward his youngest brother with something that might have been admiration in those dead eyes. Tell him the rest, brother. Tell him about the night he saved the Saxon. Leif smiled, and it was the same smile that had charmed their father into giving him extra portions of honey cakes. The same smile that had convinced their mother to let him stay up past his bedtime to hear one more saga by the fire. The night you chose compassion over wisdom, Leif said softly. The night you proved you still had enough love in your heart to power the greatest resurrection spell ever woven. The pendant in Aldrich's hands began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its surface like ice breaking under spring sun. But instead of shattering, something began. Not light, not darkness, memories. Thorvald could see them now, playing out in the pendant's dying glow like reflections on still water. Leif, barely 16, being pulled from the North Sea by Norman ships. Leif, choosing baptism over death. Leif, spending years learning their ways, their magic, their hunger for the old powers that flowed through Viking blood like molten gold. The pendant was never about trapping souls, Leif whispered. It was about measuring love. Every act of kindness you showed our faithful Aldrich charged it with more power. Every moment you chose mercy over vengeance made it stronger. And now, the coffins began to creak open wider, and shapes began to rise from within. Not the bodies of Thorvald's children, but something far worse. The corpses of everyone Thorvald had ever failed to save. Everyone whose death had carved guilt into his heart like runes in stone. Now we have enough love-born power to raise an army that will make the Romans weep, Leif breathed. And it all started with my big brother's soft heart. The pendant finally shattered completely, releasing a wave of energy that made the very air scream. And in that moment of absolute devastation, as the dead began to walk, and his youngest brother revealed the scope of a betrayal 15 years in the making, Thorvald heard something that stopped his heart cold. The sound of children's laughter echoing from inside the coffins. His children's laughter. Still alive, still trapped, still waiting for their father to choose between saving them and stopping the resurrection of an army that would drown the world in blood. But as the children's laughter grew louder, echoing from depths that no coffin should contain, something else stirred in the shattered remains of the pendant. Something that made even Leif take a step backward, his monk's robes rustling with sudden uncertainty. The laughter wasn't coming from Thorvald's children. It was coming from something far older, something that had been sleeping in the dragon's eyes for centuries, waiting for exactly this moment when enough familial love and betrayal would finally set it free. Astrid's scream cut through the night like a blade through silk, not because of the coffins, or the walking dead, or even the revelation of Leif's treachery. She was staring at Aldrich, watching as his face began to change, the features shifting like melting wax, revealing something underneath that made the very stars seem to dim. "That's impossible," Leif whispered, his voice cracking like a child's. "You're supposed to be dead. We buried you ourselves." Aldrich's transformation completed itself with the slow inevitability of sunrise. The Saxon features melted away completely, leaving behind a face that Thorvald knew better than his own reflection. A face he'd seen every day for the first 12 years of his life. Eric, their father. Not the Eric who had died peacefully in his sleep 5 winters ago, surrounded by his sons and honored with the greatest funeral pyre their village had ever built. This was Eric as he had been in his prime. Eric the Redwake. Eric who had carved his legend across 3 kingdoms and left the North Sea stained crimson with Saxon blood. "Hello, my sons," Eric said, and his voice carried the authority that had once made jarls kneel and kings think twice about crossing the northern waters. "Did you really think a little Christian magic could keep the Redwake in his grave?" The walking corpses stopped their advance. The monks fell silent. Even Bjorn's animated remains seemed to cower before this presence that radiated power like heat from a forge. But it was the look in Eric's eyes that made Thorvald's soul shrivel like parchment in flame. Not the loving gaze of a father returned from the dead. Something hungry, something that had been growing stronger in whatever realm death had claimed him, feeding on the prayers spoken over his grave and the tears shed in his memory. "The pendant was never Prior Dunstan's creation," Eric continued, flexing fingers that remembered the weight of Blood Drinker, his legendary axe. "It was mine, forged in the days when I served a god far older than Christ or Odin, a god that your little brother here thought he could control." Leif stumbled backward, his face white as fresh snow. "Father, no. The Book of Shadows said you were bound. It said the ritual would keep you." "The ritual required the willing sacrifice of family." Eric's voice cut through the truth, hit like a physical blow. "Every act of kindness. Every moment of compassion. Every time Thorvald had chosen mercy over vengeance, he hadn't been charging the pendant with love. He'd been feeding his father's resurrection with the blood of his own honor. 30 years I've been waiting," Eric breathed. And the temperature around them dropped until their breath became visible clouds of terror. 30 years, watching from the realm between realms, as my sons forgot what it means to be truly Viking. But now, he gestured toward the coffins, and they began to crack open further. But what emerged wasn't the shambling corpses of failed resurrections. It was an army, a real army. Vikings from ages past, their eyes burning with the same hunger that now filled their returned king. Warriors who had died with weapons in their hands and vengeance unfinished in their hearts. "Now we finish what I started." Not berserker calls or church bells, the war horns of the dead. The war horns of the dead grew louder, their bone-chilling wails echoing across the frozen lake like the screams of Ragnarok itself. But as Thorvald watched his father's ancient army rise from their coffins, something made his blood freeze in ways that had nothing to do with the winter air. One of the warriors, emerging from the cracked wood, moved wrong. Too fluid, too alive. The figure straightened, brushing grave dirt from mail that gleamed like it had been forged yesterday. And when she turned toward the longhouse, Thorvald's world collapsed into ash and madness. Astrid. Not his Astrid, who still stood beside him clutching their youngest son. This was Astrid, as she had been 20 years ago, when they first met during the raid on Lindholm. Astrid, with her shield unmarked by time, her blonde braids untouched by the gray that now streaked his wife's hair. Astrid, with eyes that burned with the same unholy fire as Eric's resurrected host. Impossible, his living wife whispered, her voice cracking like ice under spring sun. I'm right here. I'm alive. I never died. But the warrior Astrid smiled, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had never forgotten the taste of enemy blood on her blade. Tell them, husband. Tell them about the fever that took me the winter after our wedding. Tell them about the 3 days I lay cold in our bed before the gods sent me back. Thorvald's axe slipped from nerveless fingers. The memory crashed over him, like a Norse longship through fog. That terrible winter, when plague had stalked their settlement like a hungry wolf. 3 days of holding Astrid's lifeless body, refusing to believe the gods could be so cruel. 3 days of prayers to every deity he could name. And then the miracle. Her eyes opening, her breath returning, their life together beginning again. Only it hadn't been a miracle. The ritual was already in motion. Eric's voice cut through his son's horror, like steel through flesh. 20 years I've been building this moment. Every Viking who died with unfinished business, every warrior whose family prayed for their return, all of them bound to wake when the pendant finally shattered. The living Astrid stumbled backward, her face white as bone. No, that's not possible. I remember our children being born. I remember every day, every night. You remember what I allowed you to remember. The dead Astrid replied, drawing her sword with movements that sang of battlefields and blood. The real Astrid died screaming your children's names, begging the gods to let her see them grow. I simply borrowed her skin. Through the window, more familiar faces were rising from coffins that had materialized across the frozen lake like a city of the dead. Warriors Thorvald had fought beside, enemies he had killed honorably, friends who had fallen in battles he'd survived, all of them wearing the same burning eyes, all of them bound to his father's will. But it was Leif's broken sob that shattered what remained of Thorvald's sanity. The Book of Shadows said it would only work with willing sacrifice. It said the ritual required a family's love, freely given, Eric corrected, gesturing toward the chaos unfolding around them. And what greater love could there be than a husband praying for 3 days and nights to bring back his dead wife? Than children being raised by a mother returned from hell itself? The dead Astrid stepped closer to the window, her blade reflecting the unholy fire that danced in her eyes. Every kiss you gave me, every moment of joy, every night we lay together, all of it fed the spell. All of it made us stronger. And in that moment, of absolute devastation. As Thorvald realized his entire adult life had been a lie woven by the dead, the living Astrid's scream cut through the night like the cry of Odin's ravens, because she was beginning to remember. Remember the fever, the cold, the darkness. Remember dying. The children, she gasped, her human memories warring with something darker. Thorvald, what about our children? Are they... The dead Astrid's smile could have frozen the fires of Muspelheim itself. Why don't you ask them yourself? The children's voices echoed from somewhere beyond the longhouse walls, but they weren't calling for their father. They were singing an ancient lullaby that Thorvald's own mother had hummed over his cradle. Words in a dialect so old it predated the coming of the White Christ to these lands. But the voices were wrong. Too deep, too knowing. The living Astrid collapsed to her knees, her hands clawing at her temples as memories that weren't hers began to bleed through. They're not children anymore, she gasped. They never were children, not our children. Through the window, 3 figures approached across the ice, with movements that belonged to seasoned warriors, not younglings who should be cowering behind their mother's skirts. The boy Thorvald had bounced on his knee just yesterday, now stood tall as a grown man, his eyes burning with the wisdom of ages. The twin girls walked with the predatory grace of shield maidens, who had tasted victory in 100 battles. But their faces, by the gods, their faces were exactly as they had been at supper, young, innocent, beloved. Tell him, children, the dead Astrid called across the frozen lake, her voice carrying like wind through winter pines. Tell your father what you really are. The boy who wasn't really his son smiled, revealing teeth filed to points like a wolf's. When he spoke, his voice echoed with the authority of jarls and the hunger of ancient things that feast on mortal hopes. We are the 100-year sleepers, father dear, the last warriors of the old blood, bound in child flesh to await the final battle. His grin widened impossibly. You raised us so well, fed us so much love, made us so very strong. The truth struck Thorvald like a war hammer to the chest. The strange illnesses that had claimed each child for exactly 7 days after birth. The weeks when they had lain cold as death while he and Astrid prayed over their still forms. The miraculous recoveries that had seemed like blessings from the gods themselves. Not recoveries, possessions. Every bedtime story you told them was a saga of war. Eric's voice rumbled with satisfaction. Every lesson in honor and courage. You trained my generals without even knowing it. Leif's broken laughter cut through the revelations like shattered glass. The Book of Shadows warned about this. It said the ritual would claim everything the summoner held dear. I thought I could control it. I thought if I became Prior Dunstan, if I served the Christ, I could contain Father's hunger. But Eric's ancient eyes held no mercy for his youngest son. You cannot serve 2 masters, boy, and you chose poorly when you thought Christian prayer could bind a king who predates your Christ by 1,000 years. The children who weren't children began to change, their small forms stretching and expanding like shadows at sunset. Armor materialized around them, not the crude iron of their time, but something older, something forged in the days when gods walked among mortals, and the boundary between life and death was just another river to cross. The living Astrid's scream shattered the night as the final memory broke free. Not just her own death, but the truth about what had taken her place. The thing wearing her face for 20 years. The creature that had borne children who were never truly hers. The real question, the dead Astrid purred, stepping through the window as if glass were merely mist, is what happens to the living when the dead reclaim what was always theirs? Her blade found the living Astrid's throat, drawing a thin line of crimson that steamed in the frigid air. Because there can only be one Astrid in this tale, husband, and I was here first. But as the sword pressed deeper, something impossible happened. The living Astrid began to laugh. Not the broken sob of a woman facing death, but the rich, knowing laughter of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "You still don't understand," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the very air tremble. Eric the Redwake wasn't the only one who learned to cheat death. Her eyes began to glow, but not with the green fire of Eric's resurrection. This was something else, something that made even the ancient king take a step backward. Something that turned the dead Astrid's triumphant smile into a mask of absolute terror. The living Astrid's laughter grew stronger, echoing off the longhouse walls like the cries of Odin's ravens. But as her eyes blazed with that terrible light, the glow began to shift and change, revealing something that made Eric's ancient face twist with recognition and horror. Not the golden fire of divine power, or the green flames of resurrection magic. This was the deep, endless purple of the void between worlds. The color that existed in the spaces where even gods feared to tread. "You know this light, don't you, Eric Redwake?" the living Astrid whispered, and her voice carried harmonics that belonged to no mortal throat. "You remember the last time you saw it, the night you thought you killed me on the shores of Midgard." The dead Astrid's sword trembled against her doppelganger's throat. "That's impossible. Freydis the Soul Eater died 1,000 years ago. I watched Father split her skull with Blooddrinker himself." But the living Astrid's smile revealed teeth that weren't quite human anymore. Longer. Sharper. Ancient beyond measure. "Your father's axe split the scum of my vessel, child. But the Soul Eater doesn't die so easily." Eric stumbled backward, his face white as fresh snow. For the first time since his resurrection, the legendary Redwake looked genuinely afraid. The prophecy, the seer's prophecy about the final betrayal. When the Redwake rises to claim his kingdom, the living Astrid recited, her voice growing deeper with each word. "The Soul Eater shall rise beside him, wearing the face of love itself, and their union shall birth the end of all things." The truth crashed over Thorvald like an avalanche of ice and stone. Every moment of tenderness with his wife, every night they'd lain together, every child she'd borne him, all of it orchestrated by something far older and hungrier than his father's ambition. 20 years, Freydis continued, her mortal disguise beginning to crack like ice under spring sun. Beneath Astrid's familiar features, something else moved. something with too many teeth and eyes like dying stars. 20 years I've fed on your family's love, grown strong on your children's laughter, prepared for this exact moment. The children who weren't children began to change again, but not into the ancient warriors Eric had expected. Their small forms twisted and writhed, revealing the truth that had hidden beneath their innocent faces. Not possessed Viking spirits. Her spawn, Freydis's offspring, gestated in borrowed flesh and raised on mortal affection, until they were ready to devour the world. The pendant was never your creation, Eric. Freydis purred, her transformation accelerating. Wings erupted from her shoulders, black as the space between stars. It was mine, a trap laid across centuries to lure the Red Wake into exactly the mistake you've just made. The dead army that had risen at Eric's call began to scream, not war cries, but genuine terror as something far worse than resurrection magic began to take hold of them. One by one, their forms started to dissolve, their stolen life force flowing into the creature that had worn Astrid's face for 2 decades. "You see, my dear husband," Freydis said, turning to Thorvald, with eyes that held the wisdom of eons and the hunger of black holes. "Your father thought he was building an army to conquer the mortal realm. But all he's really done?" Leif's broken sob cut through the chaos. "The Book of Shadows. It wasn't a manual for resurrection. It was a warning about you." Freydis laughed, and the sound made the very foundations of reality tremble. "Written by the last sorcerer brave enough to oppose me. Poor man died thinking he'd hidden it where no Christian zealot would ever find it." Her gaze fixed on Thorvald, and in those ancient eyes burned something far worse than hatred. Love. Real, genuine love, twisted by eons of hunger into something that could end worlds. "But you, my sweet husband, you gave me something even better than Viking souls to devour. You gave me a family, children who carry both mortal love and primordial hunger in their veins. The perfect bridge between what was and what shall be." The longhouse began to crack and splinter as her true form continued to emerge. But it was her next words that stopped Thorvald's heart completely. "And now that our children are ready to inherit both realms, there's only one thing left to do." Her smile could have frozen the fires of creation itself. "Kill every god that ever dared to limit my hunger." In the distance, something began to howl. Not wolves or wind, or even the dead, the sound of divine terror echoing across the 9 realms, as something stirred that should never wake. The divine howls grew deafening as something stirred in the void between realms, something that made even Freydis, the Soul Eater, pause in her terrible transformation. The purple fire in her eyes flickered with what might have been uncertainty as reality itself began to crack around them like ice under a giant's fist. But it was Thorvald who moved first, not toward his axe, not toward his children who weren't children, not even toward his father's ancient corpse or his brother's broken form cowering in monk's robes. He moved toward the shattered remains of the pendant, where one last fragment still pulsed with dying light. The smallest piece, no bigger than a child's fingernail, but still warm with something that felt like hope. "You're wrong about one thing, my beloved wife," Thorvald said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had finally found his path. You fed on our love for 20 years. But love isn't something that gets consumed. He pressed the fragment to his chest, directly over his heart. It's something that grows stronger when it's shared. The pendant shard blazed with light that wasn't green or purple or any color that belonged to this realm. It was the pure, clean gold of a father's love for his children, a husband's devotion to his wife, a brother's loyalty, even in the face of ultimate betrayal. And every soul Freydis had devoured, every Viking spirit Eric had bound, every drop of love that had been twisted into hunger, all of it began to flow backward. No, Freydis shrieked, her partially transformed shape writhing as the stolen life force poured out of her like water from a broken cask. I am eternal. I am hunger incarnate. But Thorvald smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, it reached his eyes completely. You are what you've always been. Afraid of the one thing in all the 9 realms you can never devour. The howls from beyond reality grew stronger, but now they carried a different note. Not terror, but recognition. The gods weren't fleeing from Freydis. They were coming to collect her. As the stolen souls poured back into their proper forms. As Eric's army crumbled to blessed dust, and his father's corpse finally found the peace it had been denied, as his children resumed their true shapes, not ancient warriors, but the younglings he remembered, confused and frightened, but alive and real. Thorvald felt something break inside his chest, not his heart. The pendant fragment, completing its purpose. The prophecy spoke of union. He whispered as Freydis's form began to dissolve, her ancient hunger finally meeting something it couldn't digest. But it never said whose union would end all things. His family, his real family, somehow purified by love, freely given and freely returned, gathered around him as the Soul Eater's screams faded into nothing, as his father's shade nodded once with something like pride, before fading into whatever rest awaited the truly dead. As even Leif, his youngest brother, found forgiveness in Astrid's, his real wife's, embrace. The longhouse stood silent for a long moment, filled only with the sound of winter wind and children's quiet breathing. "What happens now?" Astrid asked, her voice wondering and tired, and beautifully, perfectly mortal. Thorvald looked out at the frozen lake, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the ice with colors, and in the distance, church bells began to toll, not with the rhythm of ancient summoning, but with the simple, human call to morning prayers. In a world where love had proven stronger than hunger, and family had triumphed over the very forces of cosmic dissolution. The saga was ended. The Iron Hand clan would be remembered, not for conquest, but for the day they chose love over vengeance, and saved not just their own souls, but the souls of gods themselves. Se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Scalde. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã. E essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora, para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o